up to the point where I think we're end of 2015 last year. I work with a person here in Sydney, Matt Knopf's, quite a bit. He's been a very strong advocate and behind the scenes kind of lobbyist, as well as fantastic media strategist who's worked on this and other drug policy related issues. He had written some stuff about pill testing, and Change.org got in touch asking if he was interested in campaigning, doing a change campaign on that issue. It wasn't something that Matt wanted or was able, wasn't his thing. So he passed it on to us, and Change said, what makes campaigns on their platform successful is a personal story that really crystallizes the issues and helps people to understand in emotional terms what's at stake. Like that's what kind of makes their stuff work. So they said you have to go and find someone who can be the face of the campaign, someone who has had a child die in a situation that pill testing could have made a difference in. So I'm like, fucking hell, yeah, okay. Yeah, I mean, I kind of knew that was the thing, but then it was a bit of a mystery how to find a person like that. To cut a long story short, it was actually like the moment that I arrived at the Reform Conference in Washington, D.C., that a woman called Adriana Buccianti replied to an email that I'd sent. I found her email on a news article that she had been published about 4 years previously. It was all, and had been told about her only by an unharmed supporter here in Sydney who had mentioned it to her at a meeting, and he said, "Oh, what about that woman whose son died at Rainbow Serpent? I hadn't even been aware of this person at all." That was Adriana. So we teamed up on the Change.org petition, and so there's it was a bit over 35,000 people who've got behind that now, which is incredible. And a lot of that is through assistance from Change.org. They've been really good in helping with strategy, and we're trying to re-inspire them, which they are responding to really well around campaigning across this summer as well. And then the main thing that we're doing right now is to help take that huge resource that we now have in, this list of 35,000 people who really care about this issue, and to use that to apply pressure on politicians. And a lot of you are based in Victoria, not everyone, but like Victoria is looking like where the real opportunity is, not to rule out other states, but I tell you what, it sure as shit ain't New South Wales, not under the current government. And the way that politicians have responded, there are politicians here in New South Wales that are on side, but it's different. There's a more conducive environment in Victoria. So what we're trying to encourage people to do is to email their politicians. So we've set up this page called Tests Not Arrests. It's at testsnotarrests.org. It takes like a minute. You go in there, enter your postcode, and it finds your state MP. Oh wow, it's happening.
Yeah.
And sends them an email. And you know what? Like, MPs are actually responding as well. It's been really incredible and encouraging to see the responses come back almost immediately, and even people who aren't willing to get behind it right now, they object in terms that I think are very encouraging as well. And what they really point to is the need for politicians to have more clarity about what they're getting behind, if they're getting behind pill testing. And so with that in mind, the next thing we've got coming up is an event in Melbourne, which is going to launch that campaign and try to do some of that work about making it more real and concrete for people. Members of the public, supporters, advocates, campaigners, people like you, as well as politicians. What we've got there is two women who run drug checking services in Europe, Professor Fiona Measham and Helena Valente from the check-in service in Portugal, plus Monica. I think it's very fair to say Australia's foremost academic expert on pill testing. We've got Adriana, of course, the face of the campaign, and who am I forgetting? Oh, we've got the machine as well, the Bruker FTIR, which is the machine that's Fiona is using in the UK. It's it's one option for the technology. It's a proven option, and it's one that we will have there to demonstrate. How implementable, how possible it is to do pill testing right now. There we go. There's the event page. So we just put that up today. Thank goodness, at last. So that pretty much brings us up to the present.
Yeah.
So literally the present. An hour
maybe
ago.
A question just on the rollout of that, just related to something that someone brought up in the chat window. The relationship with police. How is that going to work, and how's that progressing? Like, is that something? Are you actively speaking to police in different jurisdictions, and how's that kind of shaping up at the moment?
It's absolutely an issue. In some media work that I did with David Caldecott and Alex Wodak in 2015. It was the start of this year. It seems like ages ago. At the start of this year, we suggested that that civil disobedience, high-profile civil disobedience, was the path forward. It was what to say? It certainly generated a lot of interest around pill testing at the time, but other opportunities kind of presented themselves to work in other states where governments were more likely to get behind it. And what that then means is that you can do it in a way that is more directed towards being a sustainable service, not just a one-off thing, but something that is much more about trying to establish, these as a routine form of safety promotion at festivals. And so with that in mind, we really need the politicians on board. The police have a different level of policy influence, I think, in different states. Certainly in New South Wales, they have a very strong one. But, at least in principle, the police do, the executive part of government is still, elected parliamentarians. And so it's really when the politics shifts, the police will come with them. And I think that the police cannot do it without political backing if the trials are being done in a high-profile way.
Yeah, so I'll just add to that, Will, that I have been having some discussions over the last 12 months with different law enforcement representatives from different states. In some cases, in February of this year, I was contacted by them following the Four Corners documentary on pill testing, and there was a lot of, interest in finding out a little bit more about this. But that sort of fell away, and again, I do feel, that if there was that government support, which of course could come through this fantastic campaign with the Test Not Arrest site, and being able to just sort of show politicians that there's will in the community from all different parts of the community, from parents, from young people, a whole heap of different types of people that are interested in this, then, some of the conversations I've had with police where they've said, look, it's not actually us that's necessarily against this. And that was really heartening to hear. And that's certainly not all police, but some that have said that to me, that have said, look, we're not necessarily against this. And one of the reasons why they're not is because they can see some value, and this is a little bit difficult for me, it's somewhat perverse, but they can actually see the value in the level of drug intelligence or market intelligence. Police are always trying to follow illicit drug markets, and mainly they have their eyes on, what's happening with large-scale manufacturing and that kind of thing, and trafficking. So they're always trying to follow that. And what they were saying to me was that if we did have a testing service running, say, inside a festival, and it was run with, police and government approval, and the drugs that were submitted to that festival testing booth, the punters would get those results, but also those drugs would be surrendered, and police would then get to test them. And that would be a way in which police would actually find out a greater amount of information about the drug market. So this was a little bit, for me to be in that conversation and hear that, I also thought, well, what are they going to do with that information? They're going to make, is it going to mean that there's going to be, I don't know, harsher laws against people who use drugs? I wasn't sure, but I guess in a way I figure if there's a way in which police can get something that they want, public health can get what we want, consumers can get what they want, and hopefully we can have less deaths and less overdoses and more information out there, then, that could be one pathway forward. But in the end, like Will said, it needs to have that approval, I guess, politically from those who are actually governing in health departments and in Attorney General's departments that we have in different states of Australia.
I guess I've got one question, and it's something that I don't know what data there is for this, Monica, but it seems that there would be a flowback effect onto the market where it's becomes less easy for people to put in substitute drugs, low-quality drugs, things that people don't want. If they find that information out, then is there good information about how that actually changes the market and could make a difference in Australia, like outside of the festival, but the broader market itself?
Yeah, I think the best evidence that we have that a drug checking or pill testing monitoring service in a country changes the market in the long term would be the evidence we have from the Netherlands. So they've done some fantastic studies. They've had the longest running testing service since 1992 in the Netherlands. And really the system that they have, because it has, I don't know if everyone's aware of the system that they have, but they don't actually test drugs at festivals or nightclubs. What they do is they have fixed sites, booths, I guess you could call them, in different parts of. I was just having a chat actually today to confirm some details about these booths, that there's maybe about 30 of them across the Netherlands. And I was under the impression that they only tested drugs, during the week on certain afternoons, but I just confirmed that actually they do test kind of from sort of 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. on every evening night, and then again in the afternoons on Saturdays. So they're sort of doing this in the lead up to potential drug use later that night or on the weekends, so people can come to these fixed sites, submit their drugs for testing, get the results back relatively quickly. Then they can, make that decision, that informed decision then. Or I guess maybe they could decide to discard that drug and try and find another source if that was their decision. Whereas, in a festival event, especially one that's maybe only a few hours long, it's different if you're in a 5-day festival like Boom Festival or Rainbow or whatever. But if you're just in a short festival, you can imagine there could be some difficulties actually running these sorts of things. But back to your question, in terms of the market change, what's really interesting with the data that they've got in the Netherlands is they've got thousands and thousands of tests every year, more tests than most other services are running. So they're able to really see the changes in the market. They can sort of see what happens when, in 2008, when there was a massive, MDMA became much harder to get, and that then shows up in their data. They're able to show when the first sort of novel substances pop up, when they're sort of misrepresented and how that flows out. So you can see that kind of thing in their data. And it's just so much harder, I think, in the Netherlands to pass off crap as something else when they know, the dealers know that there's testing, everyone tests. So, maybe they can pass it off to a few unsuspecting tourists, but in the main they can't. So that's very different to what we have here. We saw what happened in the Gold Coast. You've got a whole bunch of people taking. We could talk a little bit more about what happened if you like, but what we can see, people that thought they were taking ecstasy in a capsule ended up taking a 25C N-bone, and many of these people snorted what they thought was MDMA, and NBOMe is, you know, highly dangerous when snorted just due to the potency. So we have these, you know, very obvious, you know, situations where you've got people that definitely haven't taken ecstasy. Whether or not that would happen in the Netherlands, I mean, when I actually talked to people in Europe over last week and told them what happened, what we understood happened in the Gold Coast, they were just shaking their heads about who puts NBOMe in something and calls it ecstasy. They just didn't, they just said this just doesn't happen where we are. It doesn't happen. So that particular idea of trying to pass off something that's so very different to ecstasy, maybe someone would try and pass off, you know, 4FA or mephedrone or something a little bit more similar, but not like a hallucinogen for an empathogen. So, yeah, I think there's a fair bit of evidence that it's changed the market there. The counter-argument is that the Netherlands has a different culture of drug use. So, you know, perhaps it also has a different culture of manufacturing drugs than, you know, maybe in Australia there are just a few more cowboys out to make a buck. And we don't know exactly what happened on the Gold Coast, whether it was deliberate, whether it was a mistake. It could have been manufacturers who actually had no idea that they just passed off this drug as something very different to what it was. We don't really know.
Yeah, it's just so frustrating that in Australia, you know, you really need to push to get any policy change when it comes to getting any reasonable evidence-based drug policy across the line. And like, as young people who want to be able to go to music festivals and feel as though they can do so safely, you know, what advice do you guys have for young people who want to actually push for these policies? Like, you know, what is the action that can be undertaken by young people?
Sure. Well, I mean, some of the things that I mentioned before are definitely things that I'd encourage everyone to do. Email your politician, email your local MP. They do actually read their correspondence. Even if you've already emailed your MP through test not arrest and they haven't got back to you, call their office, because calling their office is just like some MPs' offices will have a flaming email inbox, maybe all the time or maybe in particular weeks, and it's the humans, you know, and just that thing of calling and having the conversation means that your correspondence is just like much more likely to be top of mind. Things like that have a real impact, you know. Like, politicians are sitting there, like, not sitting there, but, you know, like, they're getting flung ideas at them every day. There's a bill coming into Parliament about, like, God knows what, that they never heard anything about till they come into Parliament. Now they have to have an opinion about it, and all this kind of thing. You know, it's a very fast-flowing kind of environment where essentially they need help and guidance, but they also need to know that there are people whose views they're actually representing. Like, they won't just go out there and do a thing based on a hunch that there'll be people who think it's nice. Like, it just doesn't happen like that. Again, it's about, you know, who shouts the loud. Well, let's say the squeaky wheel gets the oil. It is just about, like, winning attention, having conversations, getting them familiar with the concept, and keeping it in their consciousness. I mean, conscience too, I guess. But so yeah, definitely that. Don't underestimate the power of conversation. You know, one of the things that I've been with me and other people have been thinking about more and more is, you know, when I started with Unharm, I was like, oh, this has to be the organization for everyone. You know, it's got to, like, split the difference between everyone and be kind of everything to everyone. And then I realized that we've just got to kind of focus on activating particular groups of people because they're all different. And one of the groups of people that has potentially so much power are the kinds of people who go to music festivals, who use prohibited substances in those kinds of contexts. And, you know, the thing is that everyone, it is, like, inherently a social thing, right? It's this huge number of people who even come and stand in the same place. It's an incredible resource. Or go on weekends away together in the context of doing the thing that that we'll be talking about. It's not like people who care about saving the whales, like 10,000 of them never go stand in a field or go camping together, right? So these things create opportunities for conversation and for turning that huge resource into power. And that comes through having the conversation, through being the person in your friendship group who's like the one who's always going on about this shit, but like, making it good for people. That is like, how there's the person who buys the pills for the festival, or who fucking gets you on the VIP line, or goes and buys 10 waters when everyone's feeling like they're in the middle of the desert or whatever. In the same way, I'd encourage people to think about it. Like, that's what being an activist is about. It's about making the party better for everyone.
It sounds like you're talking
and
about
so,
being a leader. It sounds like you're talking about being a leader, like being a leader, describing the qualities of someone who's leading, just with those things, what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And, but then none of us has, like, millions of dollars to throw at campaigning like this. The way that we communicate, like that we can build power for our campaigns, get the messages out there, are through conversations and through that idea that you have a base of people who are the most committed to your issue. There may be 15% of the whole community that you're trying to influence, and they're your activists. And so, everyone on this call, I'm sure, is in that group already, and it's about, I guess, understanding your role in those terms, and then just think, understanding also that the conversations that you have in your life, in aggregate, that's how change happens. And so to do that and to encourage other people in doing that form of activism, it is the way.
So I just want to focus in. It's kind of related to what you're saying, something that's been brought up in the chat window. Just around the way that we have conversations about drug use in this country. Like, it's really hard to have an open conversation about it. I know this is something you're passionate about, Will, and I've spoken to Monica in the past. And there's complexity around that as well. Like it kind of holds value, but there's a judgment there for people. Maybe if you want to go into that, the value of speaking openly about drug use and the risks and kind of things to consider there.
Yeah, especially in respect of people who are young and who are using drugs that don't want to compromise any of their potential careers in relation to coming out as someone who could be using drugs, which Arnhem has done so well, and I think has done an amazing example of that, in the feed and things like that. But what advice would you have for that sort of thing?
Yeah, so there is an episode of the feed that we did very early on, and at that point, like, I was a communications consultant, and I knew that people only respond to emotional appeals in messages, that you can't go, here's my bunch of facts and I'm going to convince you about stuff, right? Which is, just as a side note, essentially how the drug law reform movement has conducted itself over the past generation. Although I have a great deal of respect for our forefathers and mothers, but yeah, anyway. So although I had those two things in mind, like this idea that you had to operate, at a personal level and through an emotional appeal, and yet I still wanted to be an advocate as an expert, like a policy wonk or whatever. And those two things got crunched together while the camera was rolling on this particular interview, which the lovely Rachel, happened to then make the core of the fucking video, which is me umming and ahhing about, like, what do I say in answer to this question about my own drug use, a question that, as you can see, if you watch it, I quite clearly had not anticipated. But it was useful because it forced the issue, and it forced it at that really early stage, and it made me think, well, like, isn't that, that decision, whether or not I was going to be open about that, was kind of like the decision about whether or not I was really serious about what I was doing. And so at that point, I decided that the way that I spoke, like the person that I spoke as, had to incorporate that, because that was the whole thing we were about, which is about like breaking that silence around the reality of the use of some of these substances. So yeah, but like you can also, that as that video shows, it was something that was uncomfortable for me, and I think, you know, like you think about things like, oh fuck, what's my mum gonna say? What my parents gonna say, or something like that. And in fact, I did have to call my parents like just before that episode screen, like, I just got to tell you something. And yeah, I mean, it was only through being forced to that I actually kind of took that step at the time. So I have to also admit that, like, I'm a little bit older. I maybe had less to lose, you know, and those things are real. So just acknowledge that it is harder for other people, you know, and it's absolutely like disgracefully hard for some people in particular. If you're a person who has an opiate dependency, who's using opiates and functioning normally in life and has kids, if that becomes known, you know, that is sufficient reason for docs to take your kids away. So, you know, I think it is important to acknowledge those kinds of dynamics as well. And that, yeah, it's not the fact that I have been able to speak about it. Like, I'm not saying, yeah, fucking go for it, you'll be fine, everyone's fine, like nothing happened. But also, having said that, what surprised me about it was that how little, you know, like how little difference it made. It didn't affect any of my relationships. I mean, all my friends and my wife and whatever they all, you know, knew, right? But professionally, it really, you know, it had, the police don't call and say, hey, we saw you on TV, we're coming around, or anything like that. And similarly, Miles, who's another one of the Unharmed directors, did a news story a couple of years back where he was interviewed as a tie-in with the Global Drug Survey, and he talked about being a lawyer who had used illegal drugs, and they put him in the front page of the bloody Sydney Morning Herald. I mean, how ridiculous is that? How many lawyers use illegal drugs? Basically all of them. And it's like, you know, we will look back in a generation and go, what the fuck? They put this guy on the paper, he's a lawyer who uses drugs. How ridiculous. Like, anyway, so, you know, in the same way, he, in doing that, was surprised that apparently it even got raised at the Law Society, but they were like, oh, let's not bother about disbarring him or whatever. And so, yeah, I think that the surprise is sometimes when you push through those barriers, how little negative blowback there is. And that's why, like, there's been so many times in different ways where, like, my own experience has been of going into situations feeling completely uncomfortable about having to stand up in front of, like, 100 older, you know, experts, academics or whatever, and talk about being a person who uses prohibited substances, that kind of thing. But what I think, you know, what I tell myself, and I think it's true, is that in those moments when I feel uncomfortable, that's when I know that I'm probably doing important work, because that's when you're kind of pushing through those barriers and you know, breaking some of these really problematic silences. So if you feel uncomfortable about it, it's that's because it's important, rather than a reason not to go down that path at all.
Yeah, I think this is an incredibly important issue. It's one that's taken up quite a bit of my thinking and you know, over the years. And I've sort of come out at various points to various people about various parts of my drug use history or various aspects, and it's sort of been fluid with the situation. But as a researcher, it's really interesting because we've actually, just over the last 12 months, there's been a group of us researchers in the drugs field that have been talking about this very issue and about, I guess, what are the dilemmas of coming out as someone who either currently uses prohibited substances or formerly did. I mean, formerly it's almost like, you know, maybe we've got to a point now where if you formerly did, is it such a big deal? But I do think there's particular ways of talking about your own drug use that are acceptable in society. Like, for example, the redemption story. you know, if you want to talk about it as in, oh, well, I did it and gosh, you know, I wouldn't do it again. The thing is, that's not my story. And so the more I think about this stuff, the more I realise the power of actually telling a different story, one that breaks some of the stereotypes. And so, yeah, it's been really interesting looking through. We've actually, my colleagues and I that are putting together this paper have actually looked at, you know, what are the dilemmas of coming out for an academic, what are the benefits of coming out, what are the dilemmas of staying in, what are the benefits of staying in, and all this sort of stuff. And interestingly, if you draw on, I tend to think of other kind of coming out issues. I mean, the obvious one is sort of sexual orientation, you know, and the fact that, you know, in the 70s, people like Bob Brown came out as gay in the 70s. Like, that was, you know, like serious, you know, at a point where you know, it was basically prohibited to, you know, to do that. And, you know, there are people that come out in that era, and then, you know, that paves the way for people in the future and for laws to be changed. So there's definitely some power there. But of course, with the researcher's perspective, what we're able to do is sort of stand up and talk from the research. And the question, and going back to, I guess, something Will said about the, you know, here's a bunch of facts that we're trying to convince you, and whether or not, you know, clearly that's not something that's necessarily worked without having that emotional connection with people. But yet, the damned if you do, damned if you don't problem is that if you then come and say, well, you know, actually I'm talking from my personal story, you know, for some people that can be, well, okay, well, you've got a vested interest. Now, of course, everyone's got a vested interest in everything, I think. I don't think there is such a person out there, a researcher in a white lab coat, that can just say, well, I've gone in and done the research and therefore I've got an objective view. I don't believe that that's the case at all. But, you know, there does seem to be some parts of society that will push back on that and say, well, you know, how can you be a credible person for us to talk to about this issue if it turns out you have a vested interest in changing the policy? And so that I think is one of the dilemmas for people, say, in my position, for sort of going headlong into that. But I do continue to talk about it in different ways. Now, I'm also a parent. I have a almost 3-year-old son now, and, you know, I have the similar thoughts about, well, how am I going to talk to him in the future about what I did and didn't do now or in the past? You know, is he going to get to age 16, 17, 18 and these laws still be the same? You know, it just beggars belief for me that will be the case. And, you know, so that gives me another really prescient reason to keep sort of trying to make change happen. But it also, as like Will pointed out, you know, as a mother or father, you suddenly realise that, you know, like, you know, I don't know, like you sign your rental agreement and it says in there that they can evict you if you do anything illegal and they find out about it. You go to the United States and you fill out a visa form, and if you were to fill it out and actually tell the truth, you wouldn't even get a visa. There's all these little bits and pieces in life where it's made very clear that if you say yes to that question, you know, have you ever used a prohibited substance, then, you know, bad things can happen. So that's another sort of concern, I guess, that people might have and that many of you might have. But I feel like, you know, having those personal conversations, you know, because coming out, this idea of coming out, like that you just come out and then everybody knows. I mean, it's not really quite like that unless you're on TV. But, you know, if you're just having conversations with people, then it's much more fluid and you're presenting parts of yourself to people in the context that's appropriate. And I think that's a good way to consider, you know, doing it rather than sort of being absolute and everything, if that makes any sense.
So picking your battles kind of thing, a little bit about when you want to talk about those sorts of things, is like, you know, choosing the right time, the right person, the right situation in which to disclose that kind of thing. There's been
But I guess the issue with that is, you know, I think at the moment with digital communications the way they are, like, it is kind of tricky because you can maybe release something that you think is going to a small group, but it ends up being much bigger than that.
just being conscious of privacy and that sort of thing. I think there was a little comment here from somebody. Yeah, go. Yes.
Was the comment about the same subject?
Yeah, it was just saying that one person was having mentioned that one of their concerns about coming out, and they said that they've been doing it quite well in that they can talk about it. It's sort of similar to how Monica was describing, except their concerns were more that they feel as though that it may hurt the cause in doing so, in having those conversations. So the question was, what could be the potential negative impacts of talking about it, and should they be avoided? So we've probably, spoken about that a little bit, but, is there any situation where it would potentially hurt the cause of drug law reform, perhaps, by coming out as a drug user?
I would say immediately no, absolutely not. Not at a movement level. No, it is the greatest obstacle to the power of our movement. Try to imagine.
So Will, should I do it?
What's that?
Oh, seriously, I mean, this is the big discussion that we've been having.
Okay, no. Yeah. No, okay. The other thing I was going to say was, this is an issue that as an activist you've got to resolve for yourself. You've got to have your answer to that question. It is going to come up. Here I can speak with all the authority of someone who completely didn't anticipate the question while being filmed. But yeah, it's going to come up, and you have to resolve it for yourself, and that's a process. And the thing I never anticipated in the work of being an activist is how much work I have to do on myself and how deep the stigmatization goes. And that has been as much of a process as, developing a sufficient policy expertise, for example, to be able to speak about something specific. So, yeah. The other thing I'd say, though, is that, the reality is that if you're an Australian adult aged 18 to 40, it's more likely than not that you have used illegal drugs. It's a statistically normal thing to do, and that changes the dynamics. It makes it different from coming out as being gay or lesbian circa 19. Not to that is in a sense a much harder thing, because even at the time when people's attitudes were changing, that was still a minority experience, whereas what we're talking about are things that are actually, for example, if you're middle class, if you're tertiary educated and employed, it's actually much more likely that the chance you've used illegal drugs is around 75%. That's my mental cross-tabulation of different parts of the National Drug Strategy household survey data, but I'm pretty confident it's right. People also underreport their use of prohibited substances in social surveys. So, it's a safe estimate to say 3/4 of middle-class people aged 18 to 40 have used an illegal drug in their life. So, when you are coming out, you're coming out from the perspective and experience that is so normal that there is that a degree of safety in numbers that I think can also be part of the story that you tell, and it's certainly been part of the story that I've told, contextualized it in the within that context of both statistical normality, but also from a personal anecdote, from the reality that I don't really. There's only one person I can think of in my peer group that I know who's never used a prohibited substance. It's so common.
So just to get a bit this question, I think one of the things that they wanted to know was, hang on, was my mic okay?
Yeah, it dropped out for a bit. It's back.
Okay. Was around the potential pitfalls, so arguments that might not work very well when you're talking about your drug use, maybe some things to avoid. So your positive ways to frame it, and things that maybe, we went out last weekend and railed a bunch of pingers, maybe isn't the way to come out to your mum, for example.
I mean, to me,
I mean,
is it more about having that honest discussion? I mean, clearly the language is going to be different depending on who you talk to, and you know, your mum might want to know what a pinger is and all the rest of it. But you know, it's. I mean, I think in terms of what to say in those conversations, the best ones that I've ever had have been really emotionally connecting with the person I'm speaking to. I mean, I'm thinking here of discussions that I've had with my parents and my parents' friends when they've sort of said to me, and this is what they do these days, I said, oh, Monica, I've seen this thing on the news about ICE, and God, it's so awful, and so-and-so's friend, so-and-so's son is in rehab, and what are we going to do about ICE? And at that point, you know, I guess in my position, I don't have to sort of talk about, you know, oh, well, you know, there was this one time when, you know, I had a, you know, this whatever. But I can sort of then say, look, you know, let's just have a chat here about what methamphetamine is, you know, and also that there are lots of different experiences with it. And there are some people coming into trouble with high strength methamphetamine, but, you know, actually most people that use it occasionally and actually don't come into any problems, and we've got a lot of evidence to suggest that. So, you know, not to reduce the severity of the experience of the friend that you're talking about, that sounds really awful, you know, like connecting with that. I don't want to, when I'm having these discussions, I really don't want to sort of belittle the experience of whoever it is that they're talking about. It's usually a family friend, and they say, you know, that rehab and all this bad stuff's happened. But I'll just try and put in there that, you know, it's not that crystal meth goes out and suddenly you'd have it and suddenly you're, you know, in the gutter. There's so much more going on and so many more things happening. So I'll try and broaden the discussion out from this drug is a demon drug and it's out to kill us to something much more, I guess, well, more accurate from what I can see. So I don't know. I mean, you know, I may or may not use my own personal experience when I have that discussion. It depends on the person and how I'm feeling at the time. But the stuff, I mean, we've seen it in the last few weeks, and, you know, front pages of the Daily Telegraph with all this stuff, really, really awful, stigmatising stuff about ICE users. And I think what Will said earlier is just so true, that, you know, the people on the street that are in trouble with ICE, there's so many other things going on for these people. You know, and so it's their fault, it's ICE's fault. Well, no, it's not. So trying to somehow break that up for people, for me, you know, using your experience might be worthwhile. You know, and I think it really it can mess with people's head because they really kind of can't make sense of it. They're like, what? But ICE? How could you have taken ICE? You know, and so sometimes that can be good to sort of, you know, turn things around. Other times I've actually used other people's experiences. I mean, everyone's done that, you know, what we do, I guess, in online forums when you say, you know, I'm asking for a friend, you know, or you talk about, you know, your grandmother or your mother or your friend or your cat, and really you're talking about yourself. So, you know, sometimes you can use that sort of personal experience, but sort of slightly removed from you if it feels too confronting. You know, actually, I've got a friend who uses crystal meth now and again, and they don't have any issue, you know, just to put it out there. So I don't know, I mean, I'm not sure. If anyone's ever done that before in the group, you know, just sort of tried to draw on the experience of a whole, of like your networks, say, you know, there's lots of people I know that don't have the same experience without necessarily putting yourself in that vulnerable position, but it's probably not as emotive and perhaps not as effective in the end.
Was there any other questions that people wanted to jump in with or focus down on in particular? I know there's just one person.
Can I make, just while they filter through, can I just make one more comment about talking to people about drugs? When you have a conversation with someone, your mum, your friend, a journalist, you're having a negotiation about how to frame the issue. And if you're talking to someone who isn't from within the movement, the way they're going to frame the issues to you are in the terms that they're framed to them. And the terms in which they're framed to them within our society are typically fucked, right? And so when people talk about ice or methamphetamine, they always come to you with concerns that are always focused on the substance. It's always about the drug and the power of the drug and the harmfulness of the drug. And so that's an example of where I think the only thing to do is to reframe the discussion. You can't win on frames that are based on ice hysteria. And here the alternative frame is to remind people that we're talking about people. And I think that that is the main potential also for movement building, a kind of advocacy, to always try to bring it back to that fact. Look, we're talking about people, and this touches on things that Monica mentioned. The kinds of things that we know are correlated with experience of problematic dependency and other kinds of problematic use are pre-existing problems, other things going on in people's lives, and we can't ever have some, there's no solution to drug-related problems that comes from focusing on the drugs or on drug use. And so we need to move people down that path towards focusing on well-being and on communities that care for people. And those are the kinds of things where you can change the moral and dynamics of the conversation, but also its emotional flavor, right? But also it means that you can, especially if as a journalist, you can win. Like you can determine whose frame becomes the frame for the issue. Yeah.
Just taking it back in a different direction, Sam's just jumped in with the question around participation within a public pill testing program. So, and I think this touches on something that I was going to come to earlier around, like, you brought up the question of police, Monica, around a public pill testing program. So with the stigma and potential monitoring around that kind of program, how could you increase participation, or even with something like what we're considering with some of the different, or rolling out with some of the different student groups, people's own self-stigmatization that they won't actively participate in something like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the survey results will be presenting on Tuesday. This was obvious stuff, but, we asked people in that group, it was just under 900 folks that responded, and we asked them about barriers to using a hypothetical testing service in Australia. Would they still use the service if it was possible they could be arrested for drug use or possession? And almost all of the sample said no, we wouldn't use that service. Interestingly, about 6% said that they still would. So maybe that's the people that would use the civil disobedience version of drug checking. But it makes sense that people aren't. The way that we've framed our conclusions in this paper, just writing it up now, is that this is the first step. We need to get buy-in from. Well, it doesn't necessarily be the first step, but it's a necessary step, that somehow we get law enforcement to either tolerate and openly say so, and say, look, we are going to tolerate this as a public health measure, and therefore we will not be stationing any police around this area, and there will be an amnesty zone around this area, and we have agreed to do that. So that's one option. Another option would be that they not just tolerate it, but they actually support it, and that we, actually in some kind of collaboration, a public health-based harm reduction testing service could actually utilise those police resources to provide information that consumers want, say through the web. They could have a little code that you get given when you submit the drug for testing. So these are somewhat radical ideas in some ways, but in other ways, if a government was able to say, look, we can see the value in this, we're going to go ahead, it might be possible. So I totally understand that, in the end, if the police of whatever state a trial first happens, if the police are openly against it, then why would people use it? I mean, they're going to be scared to use it they would have good reason to be scared to use it, because if the police, the police could use it to try and capture people for use and possession, and that's obviously of great concern to everyone. I guess I just conclude by saying another thing that we've been doing at Drug Policy Modelling Program, earlier this year we put out a bulletin about decriminalisation of use and possess, and obviously if we could get the use and possess offences that are currently in our Drugs Act to either not exist or only be civil penalties, like fines, but no chance of a conviction, that would be a better situation. But even in the situation where there are fines and people don't want to get fined, that they don't want to be in that situation. So ideally we could have a situation where people with amounts on them that are under a supplyable amount, that there is simply no penalty. And if that were made to happen in Australia, then obviously it would be easier to do a drug checking service. People, hopefully, assuming they don't have supplyable amounts on them, would be wouldn't have any issues with law enforcement.
I think we've got a comment here about law enforcement as well, from somebody who was recently in discussions with David Pennington in relation to the Melbourne University campaign to distribute reagent kits to students, which is something that SSDP has been doing over the last couple of weeks. We've got spoke to David Pennington the other day, and he said local police are usually quite open to the ones to work, are the ones that'll work with people who are, wanting to test drugs. It's the slightly higher up ones that might oppose, particularly if they have to front up to the media about it. So working with police at a community level and beginning to build relationships with them somewhat quietly can be effective, as a comment there. Yeah, and I think...
Sorry, you go, Chloe.
Oh, it was just right at the beginning of the chat window, people were talking about the law enforcement against prohibition, and I know that that's something that Greg Denham has been looking at trying to set up in Australia for a little while, and has been a big advocator of that, and was working with a few people on that. And I mean, that could be a fantastic way to get police on board with a pill testing campaign and that sort of thing. So I think that there are things going on in the mix there, or things certainly allies on that other side of the fence.
It's about 9:15, so I just wanted to give you guys an opportunity to, if you have to go, Will and Monica, or if anyone has any final kind of comments or anything. Otherwise, I'm happy to stay for a little bit longer.
I'd actually really love to know from you guys how it's actually been going in the last couple of weeks. If you've been distributing the test kits in the last couple of weeks.
Actually, I haven't spoken to Nick in the last couple of days, Chloe.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Call him yesterday.
I haven't
spoken.
Have
you spoken to Nick?
No,
hey guys,
I haven't.
Can I jump in?
Yeah,
Tim.
jump in, yes.
Fill us in.
Hey, Monica and Will. Thanks, first of all, so much for being here tonight. And this is really fantastic, and I'm really inspired. And just really feel it's so. I've heard about you guys before. I think Monica very briefly met you at Colleen Heartland's event.
Yeah.
But great to meet you too, Will, and hear your voice. So I've been involved with the Uni Melb effort, and it's kind of like it started off with just, we can do this in a day. We've got all the support, and we've realised over the last couple of months, take this slow, and we need to take this slow and do it right. And one of the things was that because it was passed with the union's support, we thought, we can do this without the uni, and we were willing to do that if necessary, if the uni was going to oppose to us. And they sent a letter to the union about a week ago just saying, we have some concerns, we really think you should address them before you start handing out the kits. And, I kind of felt like that was maybe an oppose to what we were doing. But just a conversation we had with the union lawyer the other day, who seems to be somewhat in contact with uni, it actually seems like those concerns that they've brought up, that if we address those, that they're going to be really much more positive about it. And we're going to sit down with them in the next week or two. But it's kind of been one of those things where there's been resistance. We feel there's been resistance the last week or two, but it hasn't been ideological resistance. It's just resistance about the reputation of the university, they really care about, and so we've slowed down, but we think that if we set it up right over the next couple of weeks and get our relationship really very positive with Melbourne Uni, that next year it'll allow us to do a lot of other things in the space of Melbourne Uni that we're really hoping. We want academics and staff at the university to be able to speak more freely about their opinions on drug law reform and on testing, because I feel at the university that there are a lot of academics who support it but don't yet feel that the university would have their back, or that their jobs are completely secure by doing so. So we really hope that by working with the university over the next couple of weeks, that next year that'll start to create that environment where if academics want to speak out more openly and support, that they'll feel safe to do so. And then also maybe working with the university to, we're hoping that they'll adopt a harm reduction policy. So we're really going to lobby them for next year. So yeah, it has been slowed down a bit in the last few weeks, but actually I think it's been, it's because the opportunities are actually bigger than when we first started.
So just to ask a quick
That's
question.
That's really exciting.
Sorry, can I just, did you want to jump in to add anything, Penny, just on that?
You can turn your mic on, Pen.
Sorry, yeah, I keep forgetting that it's not on. I've been laughing and commenting to myself. No, I mean, Tim pretty much summed it up. I spoke to Nick earlier in the week. I think it's fantastic that, it's roadblocks right now for what we want to do, but I think the implications of really doing it properly and working with the uni are going to, benefit us and the cause, and us being able to make it happen within other universities.
Yeah, it's worth mentioning that one of the really valuable things about even just getting the publicity in the media that we were going to do this, even though we've had to slow down the launch, is that students at other universities, including Monash Uni, Swinburne Uni, and so on, have said that they want to they want to start SSDP chapters, and they're well on their way to doing that. So if we hadn't come out and kind of made the noise that we made a month ago, we wouldn't have those clubs starting up. So yeah, that's been another massive positive outcome.
Yeah, and just for you, Monica, those people were a part of this discussion tonight, like Yen and Yen's from Monash and Sam is from Swinburne, and they're both keen to get it rolling at their campuses.
Yeah, no, it sounds fantastic, and the approach by Melbourne Uni, the wording of that approach, I think that's also a very positive, because it does, when I heard you say that, I thought, that actually means, we'll just iron out a few things, but that they're actually, perhaps the university as well as the union as well as SSDP may all support this kind of action, which, I mean, I'll be really curious to see what kinds of things you need to do in order to get to that point. And if I can be of any assistance, just email me, or happy to chat about it.
Really interesting, the different responses that we've had from various unis. I've been quite involved speaking to the Deakin Uni Health Service that actually is really keen to be able to distribute kits, and it's interesting, from different unis, different faculties and different parts of the university are interested. So it's not just the student union, it's not just the students, it's coming from all different aspects of different unis. So it's been really interesting to just kind of see how it's panning out, and we don't even know how it's panning out.
I mean, ideally, you're imagining. Sorry.
Oh, I was just thinking about a time frame, because there was a bit of a pause on getting the kits delivered, and then the date of which they would actually be physically handed out. I'm not sure if that's sort of, if there's more progress with that, or if there's been like a date finalized or anything like that so far.
I think Tim's just left
Tim
for.
might have.
Oh, he did. Okay.
I don't know an actual date because every time Nick goes to these meetings, I know it just gets pushed back. So I don't think they've actually set a date because it'll probably just get pushed. I know obviously they're very keen to get them out before uni breaks up, while there are students still on the campus, obviously. So yeah, we're obviously helping. Oh, there he is. Do you know a date, Tim?
Yeah, I definitely can't give an exact date, unfortunately. I'd love to be able to do that. I think sitting down with the uni in the next week is that's basically gonna, when we do that, we'll know, because we'll see how significant their concerns are and how quickly we can respond to those. I think a lot of it is just about its reputation. So it's just about, like, we've already done the work to explain the kit's limitations, and we've done as much as we can to minimize reputational risk for ourselves and risk for the people using the kits. So it's more just going to be about assuring the university that we've done all that and showing them what we've done, and also maybe just talking with them about ways that they, that we communicate with the media so that it minimizes any reputational damage to them, and hopefully it can be framed even in a way that enhances their reputation. And we want to present it to them as, this is a world first or close to it, and Melbourne University wants to be a leader in a number of ways. This should be a really great way to do that.
Other questions, I've kind of got something that maybe we could delve into that people might find of interest, and I was just wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about your research on the darknet stuff, Monica, crypto markets and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, where do I start? So I guess, most of the research that I do in, my total research that I'm doing is, doing surveys with people who use drugs, but also doing interviews with people who use drugs. That's the bulk of the stuff I do. So I guess it's sort of social science research. And so with the darknet, that was sort of 5 years ago when Silk Road first came online, and I was first aware of it. And so it was one of those things that I just got onto really quickly. We threw some questions together, put them in the Global Drug Survey. I'm also a core member of the Global Drug Survey. And so we got kind of surveys out, I guess, when, in 2012, so 12 to 18 months after Silk Road was first online. So we've sort of been at that point, and every year putting out those darknet questions in Global Drug Survey. So some of the stuff we've been able to do just recently, we published actually it's still free. We've got 2 months of our special issue of a journal, which we negotiated with the publisher would be freely available. So I can send that link. Maybe I'll put that link up for you guys in a moment. But basically the stuff we were doing there it's kind of an obvious question. If you're going to buy drugs online versus in person, they're going to be able to avoid issues around violence or issues around sort of safety and concerns for your personal safety that some people might have in approaching, especially dealers, unknown stranger type dealers. So we measured that in the survey. But what was actually quite surprising was that not only was buying drugs from the crypto markets or the darknet, reported as safer than buying drugs from strangers, it was also reported as safer than buying drugs from friends and known dealers, in that people that were buying from friends and known dealers reported more instances of kind of feeling unsafe. So, that was kind of interesting. So we had this paper called Safer Scoring, ? Safer Scoring from going online. We also did some work with interviewing people who use drugs who had used Silk Road. and just sort of asking them about the trajectory of drug use. So had they tried new drugs on Silk Road? Had they kind of escalated their drug use when starting to use Silk Road because it was sort of more available? And we kind of found there was a bit of a honeymoon effect to people would discovered Silk Road, and yeah, they'd go a bit crazy for a few months, but that would tend to ease down. So there was very few examples in our data where people would, discover Silk Road and then, then they were crazy addicted and they were in trouble. I think people tended to settle down, I guess, after the honeymoon into a more sort of reasonable pattern of drug use. So there's a couple of the things we've done recently. And the other thing we've been trying to do is using the darknet markets as a way of discovering when new drugs become available, some of the newer research chemicals, that sort of thing. So really just monitoring them. I don't do that kind of research, as some of my colleagues do, where they're literally going on every couple of days, either scraping automatically using web scrapers or doing some other techniques to sort of detect when totally new substances are put up for sale, and then using that as sort of a way of monitoring the sort of new drugs markets. So yeah, so I'm interested in that scene. I mean, the other stuff that's great about it is the harm reduction potential of actually outreaching to people who are, using these markets. So many of you might have heard of Dr. X, who was the Fernando Cordovilla, the Spanish doctor, who took it upon himself to go into the Silk Road forums and put a thread up saying, I'm a medical doctor, ask me anything. And so there's been, these great examples of, I guess, what would be street outreach, except it's actually in the darknet. So I think that's a fantastic development to be able to sort of take health professionals, public health professionals, put them in that environment and make it easier for people who can not, we talked about coming out earlier. A lot of people don't want to talk to their doctor about this stuff. They want to be able to talk to someone totally anonymous. So, I think that's a great area where we can really help people there as well. So yeah, there's lots going on with the darknet. I mean, obviously it intersects with pill testing. And in our survey, we actually asked people, where do you find out about the contents of your drugs? Firstly, do you try and find out? And we had 90% of our sample say that they did, at least in some way, try to find out what the contents of their drugs were. Around 12-15% talked about darknet as a way of finding out. So these are people going on the darknet, obviously getting information through the listings as well as through the forums about, how pure that particular listing was, etc. So, I think there is that intersection between these two issues that, is quite interesting as well.
And we've just had a question come through on some of that. When people kind of have that honeymoon period where they discover the darknet and online drug markets, is there any association with any kind of problematic drug use? Like at that point, do they go a little bit crazy on it and, get really good prep and kind of go a bit too far, or is there any evidence of that kind of thing?
Well, this was our qualitative study. So we did 17 online chat interviews. So these were like really long 2 to 4 hour chats with people who were, using Silk Road. This was just after it closed in 2013-14. So, I mean, it's 17 people, so it's not like you can make generalizations, but it was really interesting that I think there was only 2 out of the 17 that at the time of interview were actually having problematic issues. There was one guy who was, multiple daily meth user who we interviewed who, like he wasn't doing too well. And one of the reasons, he had a very strong, easy supply of meth, and he was getting it entirely through the darknet. So, there was one example, I guess, of what one might expect if you followed availability theories, and there's sort of theories in the world of addiction around, well, if things are really available, then people are more likely to use them. But what we found was a bit more complex than that. And we had one guy who he actually said, we get to try and get this quote right, but he basically said, if you live on top of a bakery, like, you know that you can just go down and get one slice of cake. You don't need to buy the whole cake. So he was sort of saying, look, the fact that it's so available and I know I can get it all the time means I can just get a small amount now and know that next week I can get another small amount. I don't have to buy it all up as soon as I see it, which is kind of how it was for him with the sort of availability he had before the darknet drugs. So he actually found that high availability meant he could do portion control more easily, knowing that he didn't have to hoard drugs whenever he found a way of getting them. So this is kind of the opposite to what many people would assume. So that was what our paper was all about. That, yeah, for a lot of people, and it stands to reason. I mean, if we were all going to get, totally wasted all the time on really available things, then we'd all be drunk right now, wouldn't we?
Mm-hmm.
We'd all be drunk every day because alcohol is everywhere. So, I mean, because we could start talking about the Sydney lockouts, there's there's obviously a lot of conjecture about how availability affects use. And, it's still a very live issue with alcohol. But, I think this idea that if it's always available, you'll always use it is clearly not quite right. Yeah.
You've just reminded me of something that was brought up much earlier in the chat window, and that was around alcohol use and the way that that's framed in Australia in particular compared to other drugs, like how we kind of ignore a lot of problems with alcohol maybe and focus, like the AFP's statement on their MDMA bust that somebody was profiting off the misery of users. You haven't been to a party where there's MDMA, like. So, yeah, particularly around that issue of alcohol, do you guys maybe want to comment on that?
Well, it's real. I don't know what to say. Yeah, 15 people die every day from alcohol-related causes. We don't have great data on the number of people who die from MDMA-related causes, but it's probably about that many in a year. Yeah, so, I mean, what to say? It is a great hypocrisy, and I think that, okay, here's maybe something interesting to offer. One of the things I've been thinking about lately was brought up by an article that is worth checking out, written by Max Daly, reviewing a Toby Seddon article. It's published in, I don't know how you pronounce it, Volte Face?
I know.
I don't know. Anyway,
I never know how to
website.
say it. About face in French, I think.
Okay, yeah. And what the paper that's being reviewed, but also the article talks about, is the concept of drugs, right, which we distinguish from alcohol and medicines. And that sense of distinction, but even, is based in prejudice, and prejudice toward the people who used particular substances rather than anything to do with the substance itself. And I think, one of the things to take from that for us as within the movement is to think about that concept of drugs as distinct from alcohol, and whether in continuing to use that concept, we reinforce that sense that alcohol has some special status. And in fact, perhaps it's the case that the term drugs is like the term marijuana, which carries with it an inbuilt racism, in that case toward Mexican people. The concept of drugs is like racism incarnated in language, and I think that something to take from that is that we need to be careful about talking about substances by using the drug concept. And one way to do that is to talk about specific substances. And then you can talk about alcohol as a substance in relation, in comparison with cannabis as a substance, rather than these very broad and completely arbitrary categories, alcohol and drugs.
Yeah, it's funny that you've brought that up, the article by Max Daly. I saw that article and it was linked to the Toby Seddon article, which was like Journal of Law and Society or something. So, of course, I went and got that article and I just printed it off today and gave it a read. And I'm happy to send it to all you guys as well. It's really fascinating, and it's a history of this term drug and how it came to represent what it does today, because he goes through like the 19th century and the 18th century and different versions of this idea of drug, and at that point it very much included alcohol, and it included coffee and tea, and generally, whereas I think now, like folks like myself will always make sure I say alcohol and other drugs. I never say alcohol and drugs. But I know even then, I work for a place that's, that has this problem in its title, the National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre. So it's endemic in a lot of the institutes that I have to interface with. I apply for money at the National Institute for Drug Abuse in the United States, even though that's just disgusting to even say it for me, that in the States, when I work with people over there, they still use abuse in that way, and they don't seem to see the problem. But how to, Toby, at the end of this article, Toby said, is sort of saying, are we actually just perpetuating this by even using this term drugs? And I think, we are, but, it's sort of like, how do you get around that? And Will's suggestion is a good one. I think it can be difficult, though, because, it's sometimes you actually want to be able to say prohibited drugs, illegal drugs, illicit drugs, because you're talking about that property of them, the fact that we as a society, sometimes to make that point, I'll say something like currently prohibited drugs, or just to sort of make that point that this is something we've created as a society. This is not, or it's a historical artifact. This is not something that's just out there to discover as a fact. It's something that we've created, and it's something that could be different in the future. So these are currently prohibited drugs rather than just drugs or prohibited drugs or illicit drugs. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I'd just add to that I think that even retaining the drug concept in that context is maybe not necessary. And when you stare into the dark heart of substance scheduling, you realize it's empty. It's empty. It's fucking embarrassing how this whole system of prohibition is based on the Therapeutic Goods Administration Schedule 9. As well as parts of some substances in Schedule 8, but essentially Schedule 9 covers what are called prohibited substances, and there's no, people have this idea that things got put in Schedule 9 or got made illegal, which is how people, understand it, for some kind of rational reason that was based on some scientific assessment of harms that went through consideration by committees and whatnot. It's completely untrue. I mean, the prohibition of cannabis, for example, it just started in the 1930s in the kind of racism that the United States exported to the world, and Australia got on board with in order to demonstrate that it was a upstanding global nation there at that early point up to federation. So completely arbitrary in relation to the substance itself. And there's no point at which someone said, should we consider whether cannabis remain in Schedule 9? No, there's none of that. And in fact, arguably under the definition that they use, any substance that could be misused or abused could be placed on Schedule 9. Name a substance that can't be misused or abused, literally, And in fact, one of the things I'd love to do when we have some nerds to do it, who are keen to do it, is to start applying to the TGA to schedule ordinary substances that could be misused. A hammer, water, my foot, I don't know. But anyway, so yeah, just coming back to terminology, the things are, maybe we even need to head to that direction to talk about Schedule 9 substances, to talk about prohibited substances, which is the term that they give in there, in order to begin to have that conversation, to not accept any way that will feel awkward at first, but to not accept the terms that we're given, but to say, no, hang on, these are problematic, to put them on the shelf, to make them objects of consideration. I think that that is necessary. And it comes back to that thing I said at the start about that sense of like how deep the stigma goes, right? Like, in that process of discovery and the ideas that you have about the concepts that we're talking about, how defined that is by the stigmatization of particular groups of people who you become a member of by virtue of using particular kinds of substances. Whoa, Ash. Hey, I probably need to wrap up soon.
Yeah.
It's been great. I hope it's been great for everyone else too, but I've enjoyed being part of the discussion.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. It's been great for me too, and yeah, hope that to do it again, and happy to send any documents we've talked about or that sort of thing as well. Definitely that one with Toby Sinnen is really interesting, just in the history of how the idea of drugs was really put to bear.